So now we have looked at what it takes to build an argument, specifically sentences and propositions. We've looked at the difference between an indicative and a non-indicative proposition. We've looked at the difference between an ambiguous and an unambiguous sentence. What we're going to do is build an argument, and we're going to ask the question, what is an argument? And then towards the end of this video, we're going to actually see what arguments look like from a more precise philosophical perspective. So really, we're going to look at one simple question, and that is, what is an argument? And to do this, we shall build on the work that we did in the last lesson on sentences and propositions. So as we looked in the last lesson, when we do logic and when we do argumentation, we look at propositions and we look at sentences that are generally indicative and unambiguous. Okay, so that means that you can ascribe a truth value to them. They can either be true or false, and then by unambiguous we mean that they we can understand its meaning just by reading it. Okay, there isn't more than multiple different kinds of meanings that can be behind it. So we've looked at sentences and propositions, and we know that there's a logical relationship between them, and this is what an argument is. So what does an actual argument look like? So the point of making an argument, as we know, is to argue for a particular claim. Okay, I want to argue that this thing is true, or that this thing is false. Okay, and really, this is the starting point for trying to build an argument. What am I trying to argue? What kind of position am I trying to argue for? And this can be represented as the conclusion of the argument. So the conclusion will be, I believe this is X, or this is true, or this is false. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we have to try and prove that conclusion by assuming a number of propositions. Okay, and these propositions have to logically entail the conclusion. Now, don't get too mixed up when I'm talking about these more fancy jargon. I will explain it all throughout this video. But first, let's have a look at what is a proposition or what is a premise. What is the distinction between the two? When we have a series of propositions together in the form of an argument, we will call these premises. Premises are represented as propositions, and they should either be true or false, but we just call them premises because it's the premise of an argument. Okay, and so for the rest of this video, we will refer to propositions as premises because we're going to be talking about them within the context of an argument. So let's take a very simple argument to explain what we mean. It's easier to show you what it looks like rather than to explain it. Okay, so premise 1, we have a premise. We have the first premise here, and the premise is a proposition that is, if it is raining, I should stay indoors. Okay, if it is raining, I should stay indoors. Premise 2 is, it is raining. Again, another proposition, and the conclusion we can draw from these two premises is, therefore, I should stay indoors. So, what does this mean? This is a basic logical argument for a start. The first premise is what we call a conditional, or a material implication. What a conditional is, we'll call them a conditional. What a conditional is if X, then Y. If something on this side is true, then this should be true. This should be the case as well. Okay, so if it is raining is one side, I should stay indoors. If then. Okay, the second premise is a simple true-false proposition. It's a simple true-false proposition. It is raining. And if we combine these two premises together, okay, we can derive the conclusion that I should therefore stay indoors, because I've shown in the first premise that if it is the case that it is raining, I should stay indoors, and we've already shown in the second premise that it is the case that it's raining, so the conclusion should be, therefore I should stay indoors. This is a basic logical argument. The two premises are either true or false, and the premises lead to a conclusion. So premise 1 is either true or false in the sense that is it true that I should really stay indoors if it is raining? and you can make the arguments for and against that. Obviously, premise 2 is very clearly a true or false sentence, because it's saying it is raining. Well, that can either be true or false, and whether or not these are true or false will lead to the conclusion. So now it's important that we distinguish between what is a sound argument versus what is a valid argument. So what does it mean for an argument to be valid? In the next lesson we'll look at what it means for an argument to be sound specifically, but what does it mean for an argument to be valid? Well, a valid argument is simply one which it is impossible for all the premises to be true, but the conclusion to be false. So let's look back at the previous argument and show you what I mean. Again, premise 1, if it is raining outside, I should stay indoors. Premise 2, it is raining outside. Conclusion, therefore I should stay indoors. This argument is valid, and it's valid because if we accept, in theory, we just accept premise 1 and 2, then we have to accept premise 3, or the conclusion, if we want to call it premise 3. So if it is raining, and if therefore I can, if it is raining and I should stay indoors, okay, and then if it is actually raining, therefore I shouldn't have to stay indoors. These two conclusions can't be true, and then the conclusion false. These two premises can't be true and the conclusion false. It would be impossible for both premise 1 and premise 2 to be true, while at the same time the conclusion being false. That is what a valid argument is. So let's look at another example. Premise 1, all men are immortal. Premise 2 is Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal. Now, this is still a valid argument. Okay, this is what we call a basic syllogism. This is an ancient Greek form of argumentation. So a syllogism is effectively where the first premise is an umbrella proposition. It's an umbrella term. All men are X, or all this or that, all X or Y, as it is pronounced here. The second premise identifies something as X. That something in this case is Socrates. So all X are Y, X. So Socrates is X. Therefore, Socrates is Y because he is X. That is what we are doing here. That's if we just break it down into its basic understandings. We have an umbrella term, all something or something else, all men are immortal. We have a second premise, which is identifying a particular entity as being a man, and then therefore we can conclude that Socrates is immortal. That's what a syllogism is. Now, this is still a valid argument. Okay, so there we go. So it's important to note that the premises don't necessarily have to be true for the argument to be valid. All a valid argument is if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. That is what we're doing here. So if we go back, the premises here aren't true, okay, except for premise 2, Socrates was a man. Okay, all men are immortal is not a true proposition. It's not a true premise. However, if it was a true premise, if we can assume that it was a true premise, and we can assume the truth value of the second premise, then we would have to assume the conclusion to be true. That is what we are talking about for a valid argument. So validity, all validity does is relate the sentences together, the propositions together. It is not talking about necessarily the content of the proposition. It is just assuming that if the proposition is true, then the conclusion has to be true. And in the next lesson, we're going to look at taking a valid argument and then going one step further to create what we call sound arguments. Okay, before we then look at some what we call valid forms of inference, ways in which we can infer conclusions from arguments.